Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're heading back to ancient India, specifically the Mahajanapada era.
Ah, yes. Around 600 to 300 BCE.
Right. Yep. A time of some serious power shifts. These powerful kingdoms popping up all over northern India, really setting the stage for, well, the Mauryan Empire.
Exactly. And what's really cool is all the new archaeological stuff coming out of early Buddhist and Jain sites.
Totally. It's like we used to think it was all about kings and conquests, right?
Mm.
But now we're getting a glimpse into, like, everyday life, how people actually live their beliefs.
Like archaeology is giving us this whole new perspective.
Right. It's not just dusty old ruins anymore. It's like we can almost touch the past through these discoveries.
Totally. And speaking of the past, remember our deep dive on the Vedas, those ancient texts? Well, they were composed during a time of huge change, too, like 1500 to 500 BCE.
Oh, yeah. When people were shifting from, like, a nomadic lifestyle to settled agriculture.
Right. Exactly. And the Vedas give us this amazing insight into how ancient Indians saw the world, their place in it. Big concepts like Brahman, Atman, Dharma and karma.
Okay, so we've got these grand philosophical ideas from the Vedas, and now we're entering this Mahajanapada era with these powerful kingdoms rising up. So paint us a picture. What were these Mahajanapadas like?
Well, it was a pretty dramatic shift. Think about it. Going from smaller clan-based societies to these big centralized kingdoms.
So like from villages to cities, basically.
Basically, yeah. And the archaeological evidence really shows this. Fortified cities, strategic layouts, like they needed to defend themselves, control larger areas.
Makes sense. The bigger you get, the more you have to protect.
Exactly. And they needed new ways to govern, too.
Yeah.
Standardized weights and measures,
Yeah.
coinage, even administrative buildings popping up in these urban centers.
Wow. So it wasn't just about like bigger walls and more soldiers. It was a whole new level of organization.
It really was. But remember, this is also when Buddhism and Jainism were gaining traction, offering a different way of seeing the world, challenging the status quo.
Right. Those new religions on the scene. Which brings us to those discoveries at those early Buddhist and Jain sites, right?
Right.
What are archaeologists finding there?
Oh, it's incredible. Monasteries, stupas, those magnificent dome-shaped structures, even remnants of temples.
It's like peeling back the layers of time, right?
Exactly. And the detail is amazing. Intricate carvings, depicting scenes from Buddha's life, inscriptions with names, dedications, even everyday objects. It gives us a peek into their daily lives.
So those carvings, the inscriptions, they're like voices from the past almost.
Totally. Each artifact adds to the story. We're not just talking kings and empires anymore. We're hearing from the people who lived through it.
Right. Okay, so we've got all this cool archaeological stuff, but how does it connect with those big Vedic ideas like Brahman, Atman, Dharma, karma? Do we see any of that reflected in the archaeology?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's not always a clear connection. Like, you can't dig up the concept of Dharma, right?
I guess not. But maybe we can see how those ideas influenced like the social structures that we're developing.
Right. So the Vedas talk about Dharma, right? This idea of living in harmony with the cosmic order, doing your duty, finding your place.
Like a cosmic blueprint for life.
Yeah. And interestingly, during the Mahajanapada era, we see the caste system solidifying, the social hierarchy based on birth and occupation.
So Dharma, this big cosmic idea, was being like translated into a social reality.
Exactly. And this raises all sorts of questions about how philosophy and society were shaping each other. It's complex.
It sounds like it. But let's talk about, regular folks. What do these sources tell us about their lives during this time of change?
That's where those seemingly small archaeological finds become really important. Imagine, for instance, an archaeologist finds a small clay seal. It's got an inscription on it.
Like a tiny message from the past.
Exactly. And it turns out it's a merchant's name.
Yeah.
And a dedication to a particular deity, maybe for good luck in business.
Wow. So suddenly this tiny seal tells us about trade, religious beliefs, even personal aspirations.
It does. It's like we get to peek into that merchant's life.
I love that. And it's not just seals, right? What about those sculptures showing scenes from Buddhist teachings?
Yes, those were incredibly important, especially since most people couldn't read. It was storytelling through art, making those teachings accessible to everyone.
Wow, so those sculptures weren't just like pretty decorations, they were powerful teaching tools.
Absolutely. And you see a lot of emphasis on things like compassion, charity, ethical behavior, core values of Buddhism.
It's amazing how those ancient teachings can still resonate today. you know?
They really do. And as we keep digging, we'll find even more of these stories, these connections between the big ideas and the everyday lives of people in ancient India.
Okay, so we've talked about these big ideas, these everyday lives, but where exactly was all this happening? Like, are there specific sites that can really bring the Mahajanapada era to life?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where it gets really exciting, seeing those connections on the ground.
Right, so where should we go first? What site would you say is like a must-see for understanding this era?
Well, one that really stands out is Pataliputra. It was the capital of the Magadha kingdom, one of the most powerful Mahajanapadas. It's actually located in present-day Patna.
Pataliputra. I mean, the name itself sounds powerful, like right out of a legend or something.
It was a pretty incredible place, strategically located on the Ganges River, a major trade route. And the excavations, wow, they've uncovered some amazing stuff. Massive fortifications, remnants of a palace complex, real signs of their military might and the opulence of the ruling elite.
So, like, we're talking palaces and fortresses. Real Game of Thrones vibes.
Yeah, kind of. But one of the coolest things they found is a wooden palisade, a defensive structure, basically. And it dates back to the 6th century BCE.
A wooden palisade from that long ago. I mean, that's incredible. Talk about touching the past.
It is. And it tells us a lot about the times. It was a period of intense rivalry between these kingdoms, right? Territorial boundaries were shifting, and you had to be strong to survive.
It makes you wonder what it would have been like to actually live there. Exciting, but probably a little dangerous too.
Definitely. Oh, and another interesting find at Pataliputra, punch-marked coins. Some of the earliest coins found in India.
Punch-marked coins. What makes them so special?
Well, each coin has these unique symbols punched onto the metal, and that suggests a standardized system, maybe even a central authority controlling trade.
Wow. So those coins are telling us about more than just economics. They're hinting at the political structures too.
Exactly, they're little windows into a whole system of power and organization. But, Pataliputra wasn't the only important center during this era. There's another site worth mentioning, Taxila. It's in present-day Pakistan.
Oh, Taxila. Wasn't that a famous center of learning, kind of like an ancient university?
You got it, a real intellectual hub. And the archaeology backs that up. Excavations have revealed large structures that were probably classrooms or lecture halls. Plus, artifacts like scrolls, writing tools, even little clay tablets, maybe for note-taking.
Wow. It's like we can almost picture those ancient students and teachers, debating big ideas.
I know, right? And here's something else that's cool. Archaeologists have found tons of coins at Taxila from all over the place, not just India, but even beyond its borders.
So not just a university town, but a cosmopolitan crossroads. All those different cultures coming together must have been amazing.
It really must have been. But let's shift gears for a moment. Back to those new religions we were talking about, Buddhism and Jainism. Remember, they were really gaining steam during the Mahajanapada era. And there are some amazing sites that can help us understand those early days.
Yeah, let's talk about those. I'm especially curious about early Buddhist sites. Like, what would be a good starting point for understanding, the beginnings of Buddhism in India?
Well, one of the most important sites is Sanchi. It's in central India, and it's home to the Great Stupa, a massive dome-shaped structure built to house relics of the Buddha himself.
I've seen pictures of that. It's so iconic.
It is. The Great Stupa at Sanchi is just breathtaking, a prime example of early Buddhist architecture. And it was likely a major pilgrimage destination back then. But what's truly remarkable is the detail in the carvings, all over the stupa and the surrounding structures. They depict scenes from Buddha's life, stories from Buddhist scriptures, even everyday scenes, like a window into the past.
So those carvings weren't just decoration. They were a way of communicating those teachings.
Exactly. It was visual storytelling at its finest, making those ideas accessible to everyone. And if you look closely, you'll see a lot of emphasis on compassion, charity, ethical conduct, those core values at the heart of Buddhist philosophy.
And those values, they still resonate today, don't they? Amazing how these ancient teachings can still speak to us.
They really do. But what about Jainism? Are there sites that can give us a similar glimpse into that faith?
Yeah, definitely curious about that. Any sites that really stand out?
One that comes to mind is Kankali Tila. It's near Mathura in northern India, and it's thought to have been a major Jain pilgrimage site during the Mahajanapada era. And the excavations there have yielded some amazing artifacts, sculptures of Jain Tirthankaras, for example.
Tirthankaras. Could you remind us, who those are in Jainism?
Oh, of course. There are these revered figures in Jainism, people who have attained enlightenment and like guide others on the path to spiritual liberation.
Okay, right. So those sculptures, they were more than just like religious icons. They were probably used to teach and inspire people, right?
Exactly. And here's an interesting detail. Some of those sculptures are nude.
Nude. What's the significance of that?
Well, in Jainism, nudity symbolizes complete renunciation, letting go of all worldly possessions and attachments. It's a core principle of the faith.
So those sculptures, even in their nudity, are making a powerful statement about spiritual values.
Absolutely. They're reminders of the Jain ideal of detaching from the material world to achieve liberation. It's really fascinating. But as we explore these Buddhist and Jain sites, alongside the political and economic centers of the Mahajanapadas, it really strikes me that this era was all about these different forces interacting.
Right. It wasn't just about like kingdoms rising or new religions appearing. It was about how everything was connected, how it all influenced each other.
Yeah, exactly. The political, the economic, the social, the religious, it's all intertwined. And that makes you wonder, right? How did these new religious movements, with their focus on, things like social equality and spiritual liberation, how did that impact the political landscape?
It's a great question, especially since both Buddhism and Jainism challenged the caste system,
Right.
Which was like this deeply entrenched social hierarchy based on those Vedic ideas of Dharma.
Right. So you have this tension between like these new ideas about social equality and this established system based on birth and occupation.
A real clash of values, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So how did that play out? Did those new ideas actually change anything on the ground, the political dynamics of the Mahajanapadas?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Because while we do see evidence of the caste system becoming more established, we also see signs of pushback, of change happening. Remember, both Buddhism and Jainism offered a path to spiritual liberation that was open to everyone, regardless of their caste.
So in a way, they're presenting an alternative to the rigid hierarchy of the time.
Yeah.
Like a spiritual path that's accessible to everyone, regardless of their social status.
Exactly. And that had to have some kind of impact on those in power. When a significant portion of the population starts questioning the very foundation of the social order, it's bound to have ripples.
Right. So are there any clues about those ripples? How those new ideas might have influenced the way that those kingdoms were governed?
Well, it's tough to say for sure. We might not find like a royal decree saying, hey, because of Buddhism, we're changing the way we do things. But we can infer things, right, based on the broader changes happening in society.
I guess it's like trying to piece together a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing. You can still kind of see the picture, though. But hey, before we move on, let's take a step back for a second. We've covered a lot of ground. The rise of the Mahajanapadas, the influence of the Vedas, those new religions on the scene, and these incredible archaeological sites.
It's been a whirlwind tour through ancient India. We've seen those ancient kingdoms, laying the foundation for the later Mauryan Empire, and how those big Vedic ideas were reflected in the social structures of the time. And of course, we've traveled to these amazing archaeological sites, Pataliputra, Taxila, Sanchi, Kankali Tila, places where, the past is literally coming alive.
Yeah. It's like those ruins and those artifacts are talking to us, giving us a glimpse into lives and beliefs from over 2,000 years ago.
Exactly. But here's where things take an interesting turn. Remember how we mentioned the East India Company? That powerful trading company that eventually became, well, the ruler of India. Well, they tried to justify their rule by invoking this idea of an ancient constitution for India.
Oh, right. Like they were trying to tie their rule into some pre-existing order, right?
Yeah.
Connect themselves to India's past.
Exactly. But to do that, they had to deal with the legacy of the Mughals, that massive empire that ruled India for centuries before the British showed up.
So now we're bringing the Mughals into the picture. This is getting really interesting. Like, how did the British even make sense of the Mughals? Did they just dismiss them? Or was there more to it?
Well, it was a bit of both, honestly. At first, there was this mix of awe and apprehension. The Mughals, with their grand courts and their sophisticated systems, they were a powerful force, both impressive and intimidating.
Like encountering a ghost of an empire, one that still held a certain mystique and power.
You got it. And as the East India Company, shifted from trading to ruling, they needed a way to legitimize their authority. Conquest alone wasn't enough.
Makes sense. You need a good story to back it up, especially when you're a foreign power trying to rule a place like India. You need something that resonates, that justifies your presence.
Absolutely. And that's where the whole ancient constitution idea comes in.
So this ancient constitution, right? Remind me, what's that all about?
Well, in Britain, it was this idea of unwritten rules and customs, stuff that had guided them since, like, forever. It was a way to say, hey, our authority isn't just random, it's based on tradition.
Okay, so like they're claiming their power comes from the wisdom of their ancestors.
Exactly. And here's the thing. They tried to apply that same concept to India. Like, they were looking for some ancient, time-honored principles that had governed Indian society before they showed up.
So they're saying India already had its own system, its own laws and customs, long before the British got there.
That's the idea. And by framing it that way, they're not clackerers, they're restorers. They're just upholding something that already existed.
But wasn't that a bit of a stretch? I mean, the Mughals were Muslim, the British, well, not so much. How could they claim to be upholding a Mughal system?
That's where it gets interesting. The British kind of, looked at Mughal history through their own lens. They focused on the parts that fit their story.
So like cherry-picking the parts that made them look good.
Right. Like, they'd praise the Mughal legal system, talk about how complex and sophisticated it was, but they'd kind of skip over the fact that it was based on Islamic law.
Because emphasizing the Islamic part wouldn't have gone over too well back home.
Exactly. They also emphasized, the Mughal focus on order, stability. They presented them as benevolent rulers who brought peace and prosperity. So the British could say, hey, we're just continuing that tradition of strong leadership.
So basically, we're the new Mughals. But I mean, that's a pretty skewed version of history.
Right. Oh, absolutely. The Mughals were way more complex than that. It's important to remember that.
For sure. Okay, but how did this ancient constitution idea actually work in practice? Did it really affect what the British did in India?
It did, actually, both in small ways and big ones. For example, they started using Indian legal experts, Pandits and Malvis, to advise them.
So they were actually tapping into Indian knowledge to help them govern.
To some extent, yes, but they were still calling the shots, right? They decided which parts of Indian law to keep and which to toss out.
Kind of a balancing act then, trying to use Indian knowledge while still maintaining their own power.
Exactly. And it caused a lot of friction, too. Like, the British often clashed with Indian elites over things like land ownership and taxes.
Those are the things that really matter, right?
Yeah.
The heart of power and control.
Totally. And the British, with their own ideas about property and law, often just imposed their will on Indian society, even if it meant disrupting long-held traditions.
So it's kind of ironic, isn't it? They talk about this ancient constitution, but then they turn around and impose their own vision.
Yeah, it's complicated. And as the East India Company's power grew, they kind of dropped the whole ancient constitution thing anyway. They got more confident, more assertive.
And that set the stage for a more, well, I guess you could say, a more explicitly colonial form of rule. Less about respecting Indian traditions, more about remaking India in their own image.
Sadly, yes. It's a complex and often difficult part of Indian history.
It is. But hey, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to where we started. The Mahajanapada era, those ancient kingdoms, those new religions. It's amazing to think about the long view, how those ancient developments shaped India, even with colonialism and all the challenges that came with it.
It really is. And those archaeological discoveries, the forts, the sculptures, those everyday objects, they're not just relics. They're like these powerful reminders of India's resilience, its creativity, its enduring spirit.
And they're still speaking to us.
Yeah.
Offering glimpses into that ancient world and its legacy.
They are. So as we wrap up, I'd like to leave everyone with this. Imagine yourself, standing among those ancient ruins. Feel the weight of history around you. What stories do those ruins whisper? What echoes of the past can you still hear? And how do those echoes, resonate with the world we live in today?
Those are some great questions to ponder. And to everyone listening, keep exploring, keep digging, and keep uncovering those hidden stories from the past.
Because, as we've seen, the past is never really gone. It's still shaping who we are, how we think, how we see our place in the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us.